All right, welcome back. We are going to finish up egoism. So this is the topic of, are we fundamentally good or bad? Psychological egoism, as a refresher, or PE, is the view that every human action is ultimately motivated by self-interest or a concern for one's own welfare or well-being for its own sake, and not as a means to help someone, not as a means to further morality, but for its own sake, selfishness for its own sake. Couple of clarifications. Is altruistic behavior consistent with PE? That is, does PE, if true, imply that no one ever benefits anyone else? No one ever takes any action that helps other people, is how we'll define altruistic behavior. PE is consistent with the existence of altruistic behavior. It would be crazy to claim that no one ever helps anyone else. PE is a claim about what motivates human behavior, and PE implies that in every domain, human beings are motivated by selfish desires, desire to further your own well-being for its own sake. And so in the domain of helping others, PE implies that when you drive your friend to the airport, why are you doing it? For your own sake, ultimately. Doesn't mean you don't drive them. It means that your driving them is a mere means to furthering your self-interest. What PE does imply, in other words, is that no one ever does anything that is altruistic out of a purely selfless motive. Where we can understand a selfless motivation as a desire to further the interests of another person for his or her own sake. We might also include, by the way, a desire, say, to do the just thing or to uphold a moral principle for its own sake as counting as selfless. This is the kind of thing that Socrates seems to be concerned about in Republic II. For our purposes, that could also count as a selfless motivation. It's not self-looking, it is either other-looking or looking to a moral principle, or perhaps some combination of both. So let's define now a specific kind of altruistic action, where altruistic action is just any action that benefits another person. A selfless altruistic action, or SA, we'll just define as an act of altruism, something that benefits another person, but that has a specific kind of motivation. The motivation is a selfless one rather than a selfish one. An altruistic act that is motivated by desire to further the interests of another person for his or her own sake. Now, earlier I said, does PE imply, if true, that there is no such thing as altruistic action? No, it doesn't imply that. It does imply that there are no selflessly motivated altruistic acts, or there are no SAs. That's a direct logical implication of the view. So if PE is true, then there are no SAs. That's right. This gives us not only a sort of clarification of what exactly the psychological egoist is and is not asserting, but it also gives us a roadmap for, if you're interested in pushing back against psychological egoism, where to press. And this is indeed what I think probably is the standard kind of argument against psychological egoism. The first premise is just this conditional claim, tracing out an implication of PE. If it's true, then there's no selflessly motivated altruistic actions. People may benefit one another, but ultimately, given egoism, they do it for the sake of themselves. The second premise of this argument is just there are indeed some actual instances. There don't have to be a lot, but just some actual instances of SAs, or selfless altruism. This is a modus tollens argument, so if PE is true, then there's no SAs, but there are SAs, therefore PE is false. Has the same kind of structure as the argument from evil. If God exists, then there is no evil, but there is evil, so God does not exist. That's the structure of the logical structure of the argument. So it's valid, and we've already seen that the first premise is just a trivial implication of what PE says. So the second premise is what needs some defense here. Why is it that one might think, contra egoism, that there are selflessly motivated altruistic acts? And here, the standard defense of the second premise is to point to what we can call morally heroic acts, which are altruistic actions, so acts that benefit another person, and that involve not just some small amount of sacrifice, like the amount of time it might take you to drive your friend to the airport, or the amount of money that you need to fill up with a tank of gas. That's a real sacrifice of your own resources, but it's relatively modest in comparison to more extraordinary cases of self-sacrifice. So examples of these extraordinary cases of self-sacrifice, these morally heroic acts, paradigmatically are people who risk their own life or significant portions of their health or flourishing for the sake of benefiting another person, or perhaps protecting someone from danger. So the soldier who jumps on a grenade knowing that it'll kill him, but that he'll save his fellow soldiers in the process. Or the firefighter who rushes into a burning building and puts his own life at risk, perhaps suffers severe burns himself, or maybe even perishes. People in class brought up examples of religious martyrs as potential examples of morally heroic acts. The people who, on September 11th, 2001, in the Flight 93, passengers who rushed the front of the plane where the terrorists were flying the plane toward DC, rushed to the front of the plane and got control of the plane and decided to down it in a field, killing themselves, but ultimately sparing whoever might have been harmed by the terrorist intentions. That kind of thing is like extraordinary in its self-sacrifice. It's uncontroversial that these kinds of actions exist. There are morally heroic actions. That's not what's at issue between the egoist and the opponent of egoism. The opponent of egoism and the person who's defending the second premise here says at least some of these morally heroic acts are selflessly motivated. And so there are SAs. So premise 2 is true. Their claim is there is no way to explain why someone would sacrifice so much of their own self-interest except to postulate a selfless motive, a care about others for their own sake, a concern for moral duty for its own sake. There is nothing that's gotten out of this for the individual, and indeed sometimes they lose their lives in the process. Only selfless motives can explain this kind of behavior. If that's right, then morally heroic acts, at least some subset of them, are selflessly altruistic acts. And so the second premise is true, and so PE is false. Now, the defender of psychological egoism is going to need to, if they're going to hang on to their view, accommodate the reality of morally heroic acts. They need to tell us a story that is a plausible psychological account of why it is that someone might sacrifice their own self-interest in such an extraordinary way, with the expectation or hope that in the long run this might redound to their own benefit. How could that possibly be, is the challenge. Some of you came up with some interesting proposals. Perhaps it's something to do with a desire to preserve one's own legacy after one dies. The question there, though, is whether it's in one's interest to have a legacy if one no longer exists. It is something that people tend to want, but after death, if there is no afterlife, what's the point of having people remember you as being great if you're not there to experience their remembering you being great? So there may be room here interestingly, for a theist, or at least somebody who believes in an afterlife, to perhaps say, well, the rewards for this kind of heroic action for the self come in heaven or in the afterlife, and there's a divine reward to be had for people who are moral heroes. And this is why martyrdom is such a big part of so many religious traditions. So there's a potential place to push back there. Although I will note that, like, psychological egoism, it's a little odd to reach for theistic religious resources to defend psychological egoism. I think that traditionally religious ethics tends to be anti-egoistic. Not all, but most. So there's a bit of an interesting tension there. In any case, that's the argument. And in the next video, we're going to shift our topic a bit, but we'll sort of keep an eye on psychological egoism. I'm going to introduce hedonism as a theory of the good life, and then combine psychological egoism and hedonism and develop a more refined version of